Sarah was 6 when we first saw her strange talents affect the physical world. Until that point, it seemed that whatever she could do was strictly tied to an ethereal plane. She could change our emotions and read our minds to a certain degree, but she certainly wasn't bending spoons or levitating off the ground. Either of those would have been preferred. It was sometime in July. The weather had turned from warm to hot, and the dog days of summer were upon us. A scream and a crash from the kitchen destroyed whatever tranquility had been in the house that day. I came running into the room to find Hannah precariously balancing off the counter and a glass of iced tea smashed on the floor. She saw me and immediately pointed to the stove. "It went under there!" "What did?" I asked. "The mouse!" I laughed and earned daggers from Hannah's eyes. She'd never been one to cope well with household critters. "I'll get a trap." Just before I turned to go fetch a mousetrap, I saw a black blur bolt out from beneath the oven. Hannah shrieked again, and I went for the broom that hung in the closet next to me. But before I could do anything else, the mouse stopped suddenly in the middle of the floor. With the broom in hand, wondering if I could somehow sweep it out of the house, I approached the rodent. As I got closer, though, I noticed it wasn't moving. Its ribs weren't expanding and contracting the way they do in little animals, nor was its head twitching around as it searched for a place to hide. In fact, the mouse wasn't even standing. I tapped it with the bristles of the broom curiously, and Hannah let out an audible shudder. "Calm down," I told her. "I think it's dead." "Dead? It just died?" "Yeah," I said. "I think so." I knelt down to get a closer look. Then I looked up and saw Sarah staring at us from the hallway. She had this look in her eye, one I would come to see often and dread. Even that first time, it made my blood run cold and sent chills up my spine. "Sarah," I said carefully, "are you all right?" She looked at me, and the look was gone, melted away to expose the happy face of the little girl I loved so dearly. "Yeah, Daddy, now that mouse won't scare Mum anymore." I looked at the dead mouse, then back to my daughter. "Did you do something to that mouse?" "Yeah." Her answer was so cold, so casual, that it gave me goosebumps. "Just like I do to the spiders sometimes." I stood in shocked silence for a minute, which Sarah took as her cue to return to whatever she'd been doing in her bedroom. Hannah slid from the counter and stood next to me for several minutes before she asked the question that had been floating in the back of my mind, but hadn't yet come forward. "When was the last time you saw a spider in the house?" I started, then stopped. "I don't know." After the incident with the mouse, Hannah and I took special care to teach Sarah right from wrong. She seemed to grasp the concept that hurting anything was wrong, and it was especially wrong to kill things. We asked her to never do what she did to the mouse again, and to try to focus on doing good things with her talents. We weren't entirely sure what she was capable of doing, so trying to give her examples of good things she could do was a bit difficult. For the most part, we just hoped she didn't do anything without our consent. After we'd gotten used to the uneasy feeling we got whenever she peeked into our minds, we started playing guessing games. This allowed her to stretch her muscles, in a manner of speaking, and allowed us to pick up on subtleties we otherwise would have been blind to. Hannah and I learned that Sarah could pick up on what we were thinking, but only what we were actively thinking about. If there was a secret we didn't want her to know, we could keep it from her by keeping a song in our heads and thinking about work. This skill, which we initially used to keep Christmas and birthday presents a secret, would become vitally important and likely saved many of our lives years later. Outside our home, things were significantly different from Sarah. Very few people got used to the way she made them feel. That inescapable feeling of danger looming that she seemed to exude was difficult to ignore. It took several years, but eventually our neighbours did start coming around again. Bob, an elderly man from across the street, who lived for his rosebushes, was the first person outside of Hannah and myself to really open up to Sarah, with a wife who had passed away 3 years prior and his only grandkids living 2 states away. It surprised nobody to see that he and Sarah found solace in each other's company. Like all the other neighbours, Bob politely declined any invitation into our home, regardless of the weather, and he never spent too much time with Sarah, but if she was playing alone in the front yard, as she often did, it wouldn't be long before Bob came shuffling over with a bag of toffee or an ice cream bar in his hand for her. He'd give her a crooked grin, tell her not to spoil her dinner with it, and would walk back across the street to trim his rose bushes or fertilise his lawn. Had this unlikely friendship not come into existence, Hannah and I would probably not have known about the incident with Bear, the Rottweiler that lived down the street. The neighbourhood children were often cruel to Sarah, which sadly surprised us very little. Hannah and I did everything we could to mitigate it. We talked to Sarah about it as often as we could. We told her that she was loved no matter what the other kids said. But at 8 or 9 years old, the isolation from her peers was devastating. The other kids' parents were of little to no help either, being as difficult or more so than their children. Eventually, Sarah learned it was best to keep to herself, which worked for the most part. It was October. The leaves were changing and there was a crisp chill to the air that made us all crave pumpkin spice and apple cider. Halloween was a week or 2 away, but the spirit was alive already, especially for the children in the neighbourhood who rode their bikes up and down the street, smashing pumpkins and doorbell ditching helpless victims. Sarah, of course, never participated, which was just fine by us considering the trouble the other kids got into. 3 of these kids lived down the street from our home: Austin Francis, Kenny Ryan, and Preston Jarvis, and they were the worst offenders. If I found eggs on my house, it was one of those boys. If Hannah found the garden torn up, it was one of those boys. If Sarah was being picked on in the front yard, it was one of those boys. They were like a small pack of hyenas, laughing to themselves and wreaking all sorts of havoc. Hannah was doing laundry in the basement, and I was at work that day in October when the 3 boys came riding down the street on their bikes, hooting and hollering like they did back then, one of them carrying a leash attached to a particularly mean Rottweiler named Bear. Sarah had been decorating the driveway with sidewalk chalk when the boys rolled up and stopped at the curb. "Hiya, freak," Kenny called out. "What you doing?" Sarah didn't respond. "Hey," Preston said. "We asked you a question." Sarah again said nothing. Austin took a step forward, unzipped the front of his pants, and let forth a stream of urine all over the chalk drawing Sarah had been working on. Sarah stood up and took a step back to avoid the piss, and Austin sprinkled the pile of chalk she'd been using for good measure. As this back and forth went on, or maybe just bark, because at this point there was no forth, Bear grew more and more agitated. Sarah had never had any luck with animals. Most avoided her more than people did. But Bear was this nasty dog without any additional prodding. He'd charge the fence at anyone who passed his yard, snarling and growling and slamming his considerable weight against the chain link, making anyone on the other side of that fence immediately nervous. There was even a rumour that the Ryans had to pick their mail up from the post office because the mail carriers refused to deliver to that address anymore. Noticing his agitation, Kenny called out to his friends, "Hey, look at Bear! Even he hates her!" The dog was pulling at his collar and snarling at Sarah now, large ropes of saliva hanging down from his jowls. "Looks like he wants to get off that leash," Preston said. "I say we let him go and have at whatever's pissing him off." Preston went over to the dog, who was pulling so hard at the leash now that Austin was leaning backwards to keep control of him. It was at this point that Bob, who had been watching this scene unfold from his front yard, decided he needed to step in, not knowing that he wouldn't get past the end of his driveway before it was all over. Sarah stepped forward, still saying nothing, and the boys instinctively took a step back. Bear, however, inched forward, the muscles in his neck and chest flexing as he pulled the boy on the other end of the leash along. Sarah took another step forward, now less than a foot away from the beast that weighed more than she did, and that was when the dog stopped snarling. He still pulled at his leash, but the fight had left him. Instead, he pulled and twisted his neck in the way of a dog attempting an escape from a collar. Bear pulled harder, and the links of the metal choke collar broke, tinkling against the ground like lost change. The entire time, Sarah's blank gaze followed Bear. Although he'd felt fear countless times throughout his life, Bob admitted later that watching this play out, and especially seeing the cold, dead predatory look in Sarah's eyes, was the first and only time he'd ever experienced real, unadulterated terror. Bear got only a few feet away before the orange and white blur of an oncoming U-Haul truck collided with him, and the Rottweiler was no more. The driver leapt out of the cab, and the rest of the scene unfolded as one would expect, with the exception of Sarah, who picked up her piss-covered chalk and returned to the picture she'd been working on, while screams and apologies and tears went on behind her. Moments later, Hannah would hear the commotion and come outside. Bob would call me a day later and tell me what he'd seen. He'd tell me how frightened he was and how strangely the dog had moved when it made its final footsteps, like a puppet on a string. A week after that, Bob would come outside and find 3 of his biggest, healthiest rosebushes looking black and brittle, while Sarah stood motionless, watching him from her bedroom window.